Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thanks so much for being here today. Today's video is gonna be fun. I can guarantee you that. I can't guarantee much, but I can guarantee that this one's gonna be fun. At least in my head it is, and that's what matters, so. Anyway, today's video is going to be one of those recommendation videos where I say, hey, if you liked this book, then you might like this book. So either the books have similar themes, or they're from the same genre, or they have similar feelings of love or fear or whatever it is. And then we have a little conversation about it. So that's what today's video is. I would also implore you that if I hold up a book and I'm like, hey, if you like this book, then you might like this book. If you have any other suggestions for the first book, then I highly encourage you to leave your recommendations down below as well. So for example, to start us off, to kick us off, to get this show on the road, we have a book like Dracula, super famous. It's a classic. It's all about vampires. And if you've read it or you've been interested in Dracula and you're like, but maybe I don't want to commit to the size of it, or maybe I just want a book in a similar vein, then I would recommend Carmilla, which actually came before Dracula. But for the purpose of this video, I'm gonna keep them on the right sides. So Carmilla came before Dracula and greatly inspired Bram Stoker's construction of Dracula and vampiric lore in general. But Carmilla is a lot shorter, so it's easier to get through. And it's about a woman vampire who is trying to change another woman. So the vampire does this by seemingly innocent friendship, then perhaps some seduction, and it's just really, really great. And it's a little gruesome because it is vampiric, and so it's really interesting watching as the human woman starts to fade away from her real world in order to become closer to the vampire, and it's just excellent. So that would be a suggestion that I have for Dracula, but if you have any other recommendations, please leave them down in the comments, as well as all of the other books I'm going to discuss. So that's the video, my friends, and now let's get into my second book that comes with its own recommendations. Okay, next up, let's talk about a pretty popular book. A lot of people have read this, a lot of people love it, and I am one of them, and that is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This really gets at my love of celebrity gossip and also the exploration of marriage and divorce. It's very fun. It's very fast-paced. It's devastating. I cried. There's a lot of nuance to it. I really enjoyed it. But basically it's about this woman, Evelyn Hugo, who's this super, super, super famous actress, and someone is hired to write the story of her life with a specific emphasis on her 7 husbands. So Evelyn Hugo's been married and divorced 7 times, and the woman that's hired to do the interview really focuses on that. And you see as people are obsessed with knowing about her marriages and divorces, but they don't really know what's really going on behind closed doors. And it's really wonderful, and I really enjoyed it. So that's The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. And if you enjoyed this book, then I would highly recommend a new book that just recently came out this year, and that is Funny You Should Ask. Now, this book also kind of focuses on a main character who is a celebrity reporter, but she is hired to interview the newest James Bond that everyone doesn't think should be James Bond. So he's an American actor, he's from Montana, he seems kind of like too sweet and country to like actually be a convincing James Bond, and she's hired to write a profile that convinces everyone that he's actually gonna be a great James Bond. And so in both of these books, you're kind of getting to see behind the curtain, and behind the curtain can be really sad, it can be really hopeful, there can be a lot of addiction at the surface of things, and having to hide who you really are or hide who you really love in order to appease the public. So, wow, the way I just summarized those books was awesome, and that's where I'll leave it. So, yeah. All right, next up we have a really famous memoir, also one of the most brilliant memoirs I've ever read, and that is In the Dream House. This is a super famous memoir. It is so incredibly well done. It follows Carmen Maria Machado's life in an abusive relationship, but she explores that abusive relationship through the explanation and excavation of horror tropes and movie tropes. So, for example, it says dream house as creature feature, or dream house as high fantasy, or dream house as heat death of the universe, dream house as house in Florida, dream house as demonic possession, all these kinds of things. And so it's this just incredible memoir, like the most creative memoir I've ever read in my life. And so if you enjoyed In the Dream House, then I would highly recommend I Am by Maggie O'Farrell. This is a memoir that explores the 17 times that Maggie O'Farrell has looked death in the face. So she hasn't died in these instances, but her moments of life flashing behind her eyes is really impactful and in times really scary. So I thought it was a brilliant little collection of like 17 separate stories that take place over her life. It is not an easy book, I will say that. In both of these cases, they deal with really traumatic topics, really sensitive topics, really heart-wrenching topics, and overall, these books, although hopeful at times, are in general very sad or scary. And so that's why I thought that they paired really well together. And I think that as memoirs, they're just such a unique approaches to a person's life story. And I loved them both so much. So there you go. Okay, next up, we have a book that actually has two separate recommendations because I think there's a million different approaches you could take to recommending a book in tandem with this one. But the book in question is The Song of Achilles. Now, Song of Achilles, I feel like it has made many of us cry, many of us swoon, and a lot of us have just completely fallen in love with Madeline Miller's approach to story and writing. So in The Song of Achilles, we are watching as Achilles and Patroclus grow up together as young boys, then grow up as teenagers together, then become young men, and then enter the Trojan War together. And you watch as their relationship goes from kind of hostile to friendship to maybe something more to earth-shattering. And it is really wonderful watching as that relationship develops, but it also really focuses on the Trojan War and Achilles as like the greatest warrior that ever lived, and just like his destiny in Greek mythology. So for this book, I have two recommendations. If you like The Song of Achilles because of the Greek mythology side of it, then I would recommend The Silence of the Girls, which gives a very different perspective on Achilles. And it's not a good one, okay? It's not a good one. So if you're looking at this one as like, Achilles is a hero and I love him and I wanna protect him and Patroclus, The Silence of the Girls will make you hate him. He is not a good guy in The Silence of the Girls, but you're getting this book all from Briseis's point of view, who also appears in The Song of Achilles. But Briseis is Achilles' prisoner, his prize after a really good day out on the battlefield in the Trojan War. And so Briseis has to do whatever Achilles wants, even if she detests him, even if he killed her husband, even if he makes her skin crawl, she has to do whatever he asks because she is his property technically. It's just really interesting. And you just watch as Briseis is both this pillar of extreme strength to the women at the camps of the Trojan War, while also feeling terrified, helpless, hopeless, and completely abandoned and heartbroken. So it's a really interesting approach to this kind of triangle of people of like Patroclus, Achilles, and Briseis. And I think that these pair really well if you want a different perspective on the Achilles, Patroclus, Briseis triangle of relationships. So if The Silence of the Girls really satiates that Greek mythology aspect of the Song of Achilles, like if you love the Song of Achilles for the Greek mythology standpoint, then I think The Silence of the Girls is great. But if you love the Song of Achilles because of a heartbreaking, tragic love story, then I would highly recommend The Death of Vivek Oji. We have similar themes of two young people growing up together, being super close, but ultimately really focusing on like who they are individually, and then watching as they continue to grow in proximity to one another, how their relationship changes into something much, much more. And these books are both so beautiful at capturing that kind of young love, but that young hesitation, just kind of feeling like their love is too big to ignore, and yet knowing that it's not something that the world is going to accept. And so we have, at least in The Death of Vivek Oji, there's some mystery, there's trauma, there's loss, there's kind of the unraveling of what happens. And in both ways, the ways that the story is presented to you is just so beautiful. And so, yeah, that's what I would recommend. If you're looking for the tragic love that comes out in Song of Achilles, then The Death of Vivek Oji is incredible. Okay, the next set of recommendations are super random. And when you first see it, it's probably gonna be a little bit like, what are you even saying? But what I'm hoping is that once I explain myself, you might understand where I'm coming from. So these are kind of interchangeable, but you know what? I'll just show you at the same time. These two I feel like have very similar themes in very weird ways, but that is Frankenstein and Piranesi. Hold on a second. Before you lose it, let me explain myself. In both of these books, we have a person that is kind of a creator, and then we have their creation, right? So in Piranesi, we have the other, and then we have Piranesi, and then in Frankenstein, we have Dr. Frankenstein, and then we have the monster. And in each of these books, the creation, so we have the monster and we have Piranesi, are these innocent, loving, curious, wonderful characters who just want to be loved, who are explorers, who are interested in the world around them, and yet have no one to lean on, no one to feel warmth from, no one to help nourish them and help them grow into these excellent people that you can see they can be. Okay, Editing Noelle here, just to clarify one thing I was saying about the monster in Frankenstein. Although, yes, he does become a vengeful, violent, angry character by the second half of the book, I believe that we see him as a super pure-hearted, kind, innocent character at the beginning, and if those characteristics were nurtured by Dr. Frankenstein instead of rejected and isolated, he would have continued to be this wonderfully warm, brilliant, and bright, loving character. However, because of Dr. Frankenstein's refusal to engage or nurture him, he inevitably does become a very violent character. So I believe that the monster and Piranesi have a very similar origin story of that pure-hearted character, even if their descent and actualization of the world is very different. So that's what I have to say. So that is Frankenstein. And Frankenstein also takes place like in the real world, whereas Piranesi takes place in a kind of fantastical labyrinth for the most part. And in this book, there's really two main characters. One is Piranesi, who is this wonderfully sweet, childlike, curious guy who just loves the world that he's born into. But then he only has one other person in his world who is referred to as the other, and the other is rude and cold and sends Piranesi out to do work for him, but is emotionally unavailable, kind of wields knowledge over Piranesi to confuse him and to show who's in charge. And it's just, I see a lot of similarities between Piranesi and the monster and their interest in the world and their intrigue and their love and joy and just like childlike ways of like wanting to be accepted and wanting to feel companionship, and yet people aren't willing to give it to them. I hope that made sense now that I've explained it, but both are really excellent. And I think that they're wonderful when paired together in comparison. So there you go. All right, now let's pivot to a really cheery subject that has no bearing on the current last 2 years of the world. But let's talk pandemic or dystopic type books. So I'm gonna recommend for Station 11. If you've read Station 11, which is a pandemic book where there's basically this global-wide pandemic that wipes out almost all of human civilization, and you're checking in with civilization right as it starts to happen, a couple years in the future after it's already happened, and then like 10 years in the future and 20 years in the future, and you're seeing how destructive this pandemic was and this global-wide virus and how it impacted the way that humans even interact with one another now. This book is super, super famous. I read it right at the beginning of the pandemic and spiraled a little bit, but ultimately it was a really, really good book. So if you enjoyed that book, then I have 2 recommendations. We have Severance, which again is about this global-wide pandemic, but it really focuses on New York City. That's where a lot of it takes place. And our main character like works at a publishing house, and she is like one of the only people in her publishing house that is not getting infected by this virus. And so you're watching as she is both like continuing to live in New York City as almost no one else is, and she continues to go to her job even though like no one is working there. It's not even just that no one's working in the office, no one is around anymore to work in this office, and yet like she continues to go. She goes to this like abandoned office space. It is such a cool way to approach a kind of dystopic type of book to me, to have this like regular job, and also not even just regular, but like as readers, I think we all romanticize the publishing industry. And so watching like your main character continue to do her job was so cool. It was so interesting. But then you're also seeing as this pandemic really takes off, and how she, as like a single woman, has to survive in a place where there is like no one around. And then even when she encounters people, like she is a single woman, and so she is scared, and there are things that she has to keep in mind for her safety. So very, very cool. The second book I would recommend for a book that goes well with Station 11 is The Guide. I talked about this in my summer reading recommendations video, so I don't want to get too detailed on this one. But it's, again, there's been this global pandemic, and there's this one super safe space, which is this like super expensive fishing villa. And it's like out in the mountains, and it's like all gated off. And so only the most rich people can go there. And it's just this like utopia in this world of such unease, because all these people can go and fish and like live this like kind of luxury life without wearing masks, without worrying about catching anything. And so the rules are really strict. But then you find that there is something way more sinister happening beneath the surface. And so even though it looks like it's just a fishing villa, there's some really creepy stuff that starts taking place, really weird things that start taking place, and your main character who works at the fishing villa starts to investigate. But the further he starts to investigate, the more dangerous it becomes for him. So very cool, 2 very different approaches to a pandemic, and ultimately the 3 of these, I think, do the dystopic type of writing in really interesting and different ways. So there you go. All right, next up, I'm going to recommend some books for If We Were Villains. So If We Were Villains is this kind of murder mystery book that all kind of centers around Shakespeare. So it's like this group of Shakespearean students who are really, really close, but they also really kind of hate each other some of the time. And one of the members dies, and you're trying to figure out who did it, why did they do it, like all of these. There's all these peoples in this little Shakespearean major have their own motives, but you can't figure out which one would have had the strongest motive. And so it's really, really interesting. And I really like the pairing of like Shakespeare with this murder mystery. I thought it was really cool. So the two books that I would recommend, the first one's a little more obvious, and it's really just from like a Shakespeare perspective, but that is Hamnet. Hamnet focuses on, it's like a historical fiction around Shakespeare's life, but it really focuses on Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, and his wife, Agnes. And so if you liked this one because of the discussions around Shakespeare without actually reading Shakespeare, Hamnet is really great for that. But also, If We Were Villains has some really grisly descriptions of violence and terror and the theatric ways of bringing Shakespeare alive. And like there is a dead body at one point. So it's vivid in that way. And then with Hamnet, it's how the bubonic plague manifests itself in the human body. And so it's like everyone is always kind of nervous about getting sick, and characters do get sick, and you watch as it kind of eats away at them. And so not really a murder mystery at all, but we've got Shakespeare and we've got some grisly descriptions of violence and sickness and things. So I thought that was a good pairing. But then the other one is Everything I Never Told You. I read this in 2021 and it was instantly one of my favorite books. This one is so powerful and so interesting to me. There is a death in a family, and so you're trying to figure out how one of the siblings in this family died, but you are unraveling this mystery through the minds of the siblings and the parents. So you're getting, like, you find out that someone dies, but then you like go back in time and you hear about how the siblings all interacted together and how the parents viewed their marriage and their children. And all of them are trying to explain what must have happened with their sibling. And although it's not Shakespearean at all, and it's not really grisly in the way that If We Were Villains was, like this one really feels like a mystery that has to do with a death. This one is mysterious because you're trying to figure out what happened, but it's not as, oh, here's a clue and here's a clue and here's this investigation and all these things. It's more like you as the reader are being an investigator from a family psychologist perspective, right? Different types of family, but definitely family dynamics in each. There you go. Okay, next up we have The Vanishing Half, which is, again, one of my favorite books of all time. I reread this in February and was again like, how is it even better the second time around? Like, it just gets better. I love this book, and one of the things that I particularly love about this book is the kind of generational unfolding of the story. So you have these two twin sisters who are growing up together, and then one of them decides to live their life as a white passing woman, and the other twin decides to live their life as a Black woman. And so you watch as their lives completely veer off each other's paths, and the kind of mystery of what happens to one of the twins and like where their lives end up is really intriguing. But from these two sisters, you also get the perspectives of children and people that are touched by these sisters. So I just love a book that does that like really focuses on family and like how each family member looks at the other members of their family, kind of like with Everything I Never Told You. You have this like set of family members that are in the same family, but look at it completely differently. And I think that The Vanishing Half does that really, really well. So the book that I would recommend if you really like The Vanishing Half is Memphis, which is a book that I read in April, I believe. And I loved this book. This book was so good. There's some really great descriptions of hands in it, which is why someone recommended it to me, but it was so beautifully done. And it does that same thing where you have these pillars in a family and you watch as the women in the family get to control some of the narrative on how they view their own families. So you get like a grandmother, her 2 daughters, and then one of her granddaughters, and they each get a slice of the story in a really powerful way. I will say in Memphis, there is some really harrowing descriptions of assault and abuse, and so keep that in mind if you decide to pick it up. But in both of these books, we just have that generational story and how each one of the people in the family get to control the story, how much of the story they get to control, and it's just so interesting how in each book your understanding of the family changes as each perspective takes hold, right? Like, I remember with any book that does this, right? Like, your first perspective is the one you trust right away because you're like, oh, this must be my main character. And then in each of these books, right when you get a new character, you're like, oh, I didn't think of it that way. Like, I'm reading about a similar event, but I'm reading it from someone else. And so now I'm kind of viewing it differently. And now I see why it was so hurtful, or now I see why this character did it. And they're both just so fantastic in very different ways. So there you go. All right, everyone, that is where I'm gonna call it. I've talked about like 20 books in this video, so I'm gonna call it there. I'm gonna stop us now, but I do have a list of like 10 other books that I could have mentioned, and so if you want a part 2, please let me know. If you'd also like a part 2 and you want to give me some book recommendations to talk about, right? If you're like, hey, how about a recommendation for like Pride and Prejudice? Then let me know and I will make a follow-up video because this was really fun for me. And you know, I promised fun. Whether I was able to deliver is still up for debate, but at least it was a joy to film. So anyway, that's the end of this video, my friends. I hope you had fun and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!